Daf Peiches Amud Aleph, the second line from the top. We're discussing the heterim that Rav Chananya ben Akavya made for the Anshe Tveria. The third is as follows. Umistapchem ba'aluntis. On Shabbos, people can dry themselves with a towel. If they wash themselves in cold water, which Mikra Din, it would be mutter, not hot water, but cold water. Now we're not noyeg even with cold water. But Mikra Din, it would be mutter. And if they dry themselves, you're allowed to dry yourself with a towel. Mistapim galuntis. Mahi the sanya. Mistapim galuntis. A person can dry himself with a towel. Umanichem b'chalon, and he can put it in the window. Meaning, according to the Tanakama, you can't carry it home, because if you carry it home, we're worried that he'll squeeze out the water, which is malabin, which is bleaching. But he can put it on the window or in a cubby and leave it there, and we're not concerned. But v'loim serena lo el, but you cannot give it to the bathhouse attendants because they are chashud that they will squeeze out the towel, so you can't give it to them. But Rav Shimon says that it's mutter, you can even bring it home, and we're not concerned that you will squeeze out the towel. As the Ran explains, normally we would be concerned, but over here it's that people had to bathe and they had to wash themselves, and therefore they were mattered according to Rav Shimon, and he says you can even bring it home, and we're not concerned, we're not geyser that he will squeeze out the towel. Now Mishnah said that you can draw water from the body of water, which is a caramelist. You can draw the water to the balconies if they have the mechitzas tluyas, if they have the hanging partitions. This heter is to draw the water, but to pour it down, the wastewater, to pour it down, it's also, that's also. Why is it also? Because we're worried that you're pouring down the water. Now, even though within the partitions, the hanging partitions, it's considered Rishus Yachid, we're afraid that it'll be poured in out to the sides, which are a caramelist, and you'll be pouring it into the caramelist. And therefore, we say that you cannot pour out the wastewater. You can draw the water where we don't have that concern, but pouring out the wastewater, we do have that concern. Taisa says that even though we said by a svina, we learned that you can in Masechet Shabbos that you can pour down the sheifchen down the sides of a ship. You could pour it down the sides of the ship, and the reason is because kaichai lo geyser b'karmelis. We're not geyser on an indirect transfer in a caramelist. So if he just pours it down the sides of the walls of the ship and then it travels into the caramelist, we're not concerned because they were not geyser. Rabban were not geyser kaichai indirect transfer by a caramelist. Now, why over here are we geyser? So says because over here we're afraid when he throws it down, it might be not only that it goes within the enclosure and then travels out and then flows out. It might be when he pours it out, when he dumps it out, it goes directly into the caramelist. So it's a concern that it will not be indirect but direct, and that's why it's awesome. Maskiv Lorish is, you're telling me that to pour it out, the wastewater is also. What is the difference between this and the case of an uka? We'll see in the Mishnah coming up that an uka is a cesspool. The person has a small chotzer, less than $1 amos. So he cannot pour out the wastewater unless he has a cesspool. He has a pit, a pool, where he pours it into that pool over there. Now, even though it flows from there, it'll flow out. And it flows out to the street. Nevertheless, it's mutter. So you see that you could pour into the wastewater down, even though ultimately it flows out. So what's the chiluk? So the more answer is time. In the case of the uka of the cesspool, normally it gets absorbed into the ground. So normally it doesn't flow out, it gets absorbed into the ground. And therefore, even if it does flow out, that's not his real intention. But over here you're talking about throwing it into the water. There's no absorption, so his intention is to have it flow out, to pour it out. And therefore, over here, it would be osir. Ikadamar, some say a different version, that what he said was that don't say that it's dafka lamalas, that it's mutter. But lishbach is also, but to pour out the waste is also, lishbach nami shari, pouring out is also mutter. Amarash is pshita. Hainu uka, of course. Isn't this the case of uka? And the case of the uka is mutter. Whereas no mao, the same time you might think in the case of the uka, the waters generally get absorbed into the ground, and that's his intention. Vahani loy time, where here it's not, and therefore here you would say it's also kamash malan. According to this version, kamash malan, that it's mutter. So the Mishnah says v'chein shtei zusaros, and like we said, some are not greatest of chain. You have two gzusros, you have two balconies, and if they made a mechitza for the upper one and they didn't make it for the lower one, shneim are asurs, they're both also unless they make an eruv. They have to make an eruv. So that means is that since they both have use of it, and therefore they would author on each other. So, where do we say that they would answer the bottom one, would answer on the top one? It's only when they're close to each other. That's only when they're close to each other. They're in 4 tfachim of each other. Therefore, the bottom one has also use which is not considered a use which is totally inconvenient, which is use which is only through the avir. So they're close together. The bottom one can use it by throwing it up, and the top one can use it by lowering it down, and they're close to each other, therefore they both have the use of it, and it's also without an eruv. But avul if they're apart from each other, they're more than 4 tvachim apart from each other, the upper one is mutter because its use is easy. It's because even there's no eruv, it's considered, we attribute the use of it to the upper one because its use comes more directly and more easily. So therefore, but the bottom one would be awesome. And Rav follows his own time that he says that ein adam that a person cannot, one party who has a use of it only through avir, only by throwing it through the air, he can't access it by walking through it or through the ground, only by throwing through the air space. His use is not considered to be a use of that's considered a use that's easy enough or that is accessible enough to be able to be considered an equal user as the other person who can use it directly on not davir, and therefore we would attribute the use onto the upper one in this case. If the bottom one is more than 4 tefachim away, his use is only through avir. We would not consider his use frequent enough or legitimate enough to therefore aser on the top one, and in this case the upper one would be mutter, not the bottom one, even if there's no eruv. Amar Rav, Amar Rabbi Chia, Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Ishia, and Rav Yosef said in the Rav Ishia, Yesh Gazel b'Shabbos. There is a din Gezel b'Shabbos, meaning there is, according to this understanding in the Havamina, there is a kinyan gezel, just like by gzela, there's such a concept as kinyan gzela. If the gazlan steals something, it has certain effects. It carries with it a kinyan which has certain obligations and certain rights with it. Here also, legabi Shabbos, there is gzela, meaning if a person one neighbor used his friends, there was a churba, there was a ruin, and he was accustomed to using it during the week. On Shabbos, we say he has a kinyan in it, and it belongs to him. So in this respect, that he does not have to make an eruv. He can use it, even though it doesn't belong to him. He can use it without an eruv. The churba machzer lebalim, and now this statement, which seems to be a contradiction, says a churba ruin is returned, it restores to the owner, which would seem to be just the opposite. That even if the neighbor was using this churba, legabi Shabbos, we say that it belongs to the rightful owner. There's no kinyan zeil on it, and therefore, if the neighbor wants to use it, he has to make an eruv. So, effectively, more hagufakash, it seems to be a stira. Amrad yesh gezel b'Shabbos. You said there's gezel on Shabbos al makan. That means that the neighbor that was accustomed to using the Korban has a kinyan, and he can use it on Shabbos, carry there, without an Eruv. V'chorba machzer lebalim, which implies alma loy kanya, that he's not koine, and as far as the usage on Shabbos, it goes to the rightful owner, even if he's not accustomed to using it during the week. More explains Hachikamer. Yesh din gezel b'Shabbos, not yesh gezel b'Shabbos, yesh din gezel, meaning that we treat it as gzela. D'chorba machzer lebalim, because the chorba goes back to the owner, even if the neighbor was accustomed to using the neighboring chorba, but he's not the owner. Legabi Shabbos, legabi din of carrying, legabi din of eruv, the chorba belongs to the rightful owner, and if the neighbor wants to use it, he has to make an eruv. Amar Rabba u'meisvinan ashmaitza. We have a kasha from this, from our Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah, "V'chein shtei gzeros u'lamala mitzu." If you have two balconies, one on top of the other, so it says if they made an eruv for the top one and not for the bottom one, they're both awesome. That means that l'chayra, that the bottom balcony, the owner, the user of the bottom balcony, was accustomed to using the top one during the week. Now, even though he's not the owner, but he was accustomed to using it, he asers it on the owner on top. And therefore, it's also for both of them without an Eruv. So you see that he has a kinyan in it, and he is considered to be a rightful user of it. So Navi Amrad Yesh Din Gazel b'Shabbos, we say the din of Gzeil applies in Shabbos, Amayasuras. Why should the people, the residents of the upper balcony, be also? We should say that the lower balcony people, there's a din of gzela, and they're not allowed to use it, and therefore their usage of it, even though they do use it during the week, their usage of it, legabe the din of carrying on Shabbos, is considered gzela. They're not the rightful users, and they should not aser it on the top ones. Rav Sheishes also mechitza b'shutfos. No, over here it's not a gzela, because not only did they use it, but they built it together. They made the mechitza, which is matir, the drawing of the water. They made it together, so therefore they are considered rightful owners of that. They have a right of usage of it, a right of way, and therefore they would answer on the top ones. Rightfully so, they would answer on the top ones, and therefore an Eruv is required. And if not, then even the top one is also. Well, if that's the case, and if they contributed to the mechitza on top, and they have rights in it, now the Mishnah is mashma that the bottom one only answers on the top one if the bottom one did not make their own mechitza. But if that's the case, and if they contributed to the top one, they have a right of usage. So if so, even if the bottom one made their own mechitza on their own balcony, they should still aser on the top ones. More answers, no. Since they made their own mechitzas for the bottom balcony, gali daita, they revealed their das, their intention. They revealed their intentions that they do not want to use the top one, they want to use the bottom one for Shabbos, so therefore they're misalik themselves from the top one, and therefore they would not aser on the top one. Zog the Mishnah, Chalzer sheep chusama arba amayis. If you have a chalzer which is small, it's less than 4 by 4 amas, ein shayfchin b'seicha mayim b'Shabbos, you can't pour out wastewater into it Shabbos, elim kain also la'uka, unless you make a cesspool for it, which is maksekes asayim and neke ulamata, which is large enough to hold 2 saws asayim min neke ulamata, from the hole which drains out into the Rishus Harabim and below. So as we said before, the concern over here is that if you have a small chatzer, you pour out the wastewater, it'll flow directly into the Rishus Harabim. People will think that its intention is to pour it out into the Rishus Harabim. Therefore, it has to have a cesspool. It has to have an uka, a cesspool that can contain the water, absorb what is normally the normal daily use of water for a person is sasaim, and then it will then be absorbed into the ground, which we assume is his intention. But if there is an overflow, then it happens memela. He's not pouring it directly, and his intention is to have it absorbed into the ground. So therefore, we say even if it does flow into the Rishus Rabim, it's mutter. So how large does it have to be? It has to have a sasayim from below the hole which drains into the Rishus Rabim. It has to be able to contain a sasayim, so that we say it'll be, as he pours it in, it'll be absorbed into the ground, and it won't flow directly into the Rishus Rabim. Bein mechutz, bein mibachutz, bein mibifneim. This uka can be either within the chotzer or right outside the chotzer. Now, how can it be outside the chotzer? If it's outside the chotzer, how can he take it from his chotzer, which is Rishus Yachid, and pour it outside if the outside is Rishus Rabim? Therefore, this cesspool, this uka, has to have the dimensions either a Rishus Yachid or a Makom Patur. Therefore, we have to ensure that the cesspool, this uka, that the dimensions have to be at least 3 tefachim deep, because otherwise it become part of the Rishus Rabim, and it has to have a width of less than dalet tefachim. Then it'll be a Makom Patur. And if it has the dimensions of Rishus Yachid, then it would also be mutter, but we have to ensure that it has the dimensions of at least of a Makom Patur, which will allow him to pour the water into it from the Rishus Yachid. So therefore, to ensure that the hole, now even if he digs the hole and it's 3 deep, less than 4 tefachim, but it might get filled with all kinds of dirt and stones and debris, and therefore the size might change. So we have to ensure that it has that depth of at least 3 tefachim, and we have to ensure that it's not more than width of dalet tefachim. So we have to cover it to make sure that the dimension doesn't change. So you can pour it in bein b'chutz bein b'fneim. If it's outside, he has to cover it, because he has to cover it to ensure that it doesn't become less than a depth of 3. But inside, if it's inside the chotzer, he doesn't have to cover it because it's within the Rishus Yachid, so he doesn't have to cover it. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Dirshu kamra arba amis b'Rishus Rabim. If you have a biv, that drainage conduit, that is covered for the first dalet amis, and it flows from the chotzer to the Rishus Rabim. So it's flowing out into the Rishus Rabim. It's covered with an area of 4x4 amas. Now, an area of 4x4 amas normally would be enough of an area to absorb a sasayim of the drainage of the liquid that's being thrown out, that's being the waste, the liquid that's being poured into it. So therefore, under normal circumstances, before it reaches the uncovered portion and before it reaches into the Rishus Rabim, it will already have been able to be absorbed into the ground. So therefore, he says, you can pour it, you can pour the wastewater into it on Shabbos, because even if it does flow into the Rishus Rabim, since normally it will be absorbed into the ground, therefore it doesn't have the appearance of being poured directly into the Rishus Rabim. The intent is not to pour it directly into the Rishus Rabim, and he in fact is not. So therefore it's mutter. And even if it does happen to flow into the Rishus Rabim, that's not its intent, and therefore there's no reason to be geyser. But they say, even if the conduit runs along the rooftop or on a chaser which is me'am, it's even 100 amas till it gets to the Rishus Rabim. Nevertheless, still lo yishbach al pi abiv, you can't pour it directly into the opening of the conduit, because we are afraid that if you do, it will flow with force directly into the Rishus Rabim, and therefore it's construed as pouring it directly into the Rishus Rabim. So what must you do? You pour it onto the roof, and then it falls on its own. It flows into the conduit. You pour it not directly. You pour it onto the roof or onto the to the chotzer, and it flows on its own. It flows into the conduit, but you cannot pour it directly into the conduit because it might be poured with force, which might be therefore intentionally pouring it in so that it will flow into the Rishus Rabim. So we said in the ratio of the Mishnah that a chaser needs this cesspool, is required to have this uka if it's a small chaser, if it's not dalet al dalet. So how do we calculate the dalet al dalet? So you can combine a chaser and the portico, you can combine it for dalet amas, and then it would be considered to have the dalet amas. You can combine it, and then it would be considered to have the dalet amas, and therefore you would not require the uka. Now, similarly, if you have two dutas, so some take out the word v'chein because it's really a different concept over here. If you have shtei dutois, two store balconies opposite each other, and the chaser is less than 4 amas, the chaser below is less than 4 amas, so you're required to have an uka cesspool in order to pour out the waste. Mixals and also uka, some of them made the uka, some of them made the cesspool. Mixals and loy also uka, and some did not. And also uka mutorim, loy also uka asurim. The ones that made the uka is mutar, they can pour it out, but the ones who did not cannot.